Alright, hello again everyone. Hopefully this thing is actually already recording and I'm not just starting in mid-sentence. But either way, welcome back again. You should be here for my American History 2 class again as always. If not, I'm not sure why you're here at this point because it has been a couple of weeks. But if there are any confusions regarding any class schedules or anything, please do let me or administration know. In the meantime, since I'm assuming you're all here for the same purpose, this week, we're going to be starting to look mainly at the Plains Wars. And to start off with, we're going to be looking at the westward expansion that led to the start of the Plains Wars as a whole, covering mainly the 1850s to 1890. This, of course, will be topic 1 of this week, so this should be the recorded lecture you are viewing first. Now, as always, we're going to start off with the key terms, as always. Remember that a lot of your content quiz information and future assignments will draw from here as well. This is also good evidence and good topics to discuss when you're working on future writing assignments and debates. Please do keep all of that in mind. Now, the main things we're going to look at today are the Great Plains. We're going to look at Manifest Destiny. We're going to look at something called the Homestead Act of 1862. We're going to look at the Battle of the Greasy Grass. And we're also going to look at something called Wounded Knee. So those are the main things you need to focus on as you're watching this lecture and going through your notes and all that wonderful fun stuff. In the meantime, upcoming dates. I also, of course, want to make sure you know what's coming up in the near future. So your first content quiz is going to be due this Friday at 5 p.m. It will be posted, of course, on our Moodle page. Second American History class, your Moodle page looks exactly like this, so there shouldn't be any issues. It will be posted on week 3, which I have not posted anything yet at the time of recording. I'll post everything once my recordings are done. But it will be posted, the content quiz will be posted here under Learning Activities. If you have any issues finding it, please let me know. Then, of course, all of the lectures and the readings and supplemental stuff will be posted here as well, just like the past couple of weeks. So please do keep that in mind. If you have any questions about it, please let me know. Your final essay thesis statements are due September the 18th at 5 p.m. The information on this assignment can be found in the final essay prompt. I'm going to go over that actually in more detail in just a second, but please do keep that in mind. And finally, your second writing assignment will be due on September the 25th at 5 p.m. As most of you probably already know, your prompt and your rubric can already be found fairly quickly on Moodle. Just go up right here where it says Writing Assignment 2. It gives you the prompt, the rubric, and the submission area. Again, any questions, please let me know as soon as you possibly can. In the meantime, I just want to give you a quick reminder on some course announcements I made late last week. Please do remember, you will not have any creative response or discussion forum assignments posted on the same week you have a writing assignment or debate due. Your syllabus on your course should have been updated to reflect this. If for some reason it's still showing the old syllabus, please do let me know. Now, also do remember these will still be posted on the weeks we have content quizzes as of now, but the word count requirements will be lower during these weeks. So essentially, since content quizzes shouldn't take as much work as a big writing assignment or a debate, I'll still post them during those weeks, but they'll be a reduced requirement. I'll post them normally with the requirements I set up at the beginning of the semester when no other assignment is due for that entire week. Should be pretty simple, hopefully. Do let me know if you have any questions about any of these, and also do remember that your creative response assignment from last week is extra credit, so you will not be penalized if you did not turn that in. Also, a quick sort of blanket reminder, because this is a question I've still been getting a decent amount, so I want to make sure it's cleared up. Only your major writing assignments, as I said in the prompts, require formal citations. So in those, you must have in-text citations and works cited pages. As of now, there are no exceptions. If there are any exceptions ever, excuse me for stuttering a little, but if there are ever any exceptions, I will let you know as soon as I possibly can. But as of now, there will be no exceptions to that rule. However, as I've also mentioned a few times, but I want to make sure I'm very clear about this, all of your assignments are going to get better grades if you draw on information from class and research sources. So you don't have to cite anything, but you still need to, as I've mentioned several times, you still need to mention specific evidence and examples when you're making any assignment. I don't want any blanket or general statements on anything you do. referencing specific sources and examples is still a good idea. You're just not going to have to put in any in-text citations, and you don't have to make a works cited page. Last thing about this, do keep in mind, this is not a license to plagiarize. You're still, of course, not allowed to copy someone else's work, be it from a primary source or a secondary source, as your own. All this means is I'm not requiring you to formally cite anything. If you do want to directly quote a source, it still needs to have at least parentheses or something to let me know you're quoting somebody. You just don't have to formally cite it. If you have any questions about that, like anything else, let me know as soon as you possibly can. Next up, I do want to go a little bit more in depth on the final essay and what I expect from that assignment and all the assignments related to it, since your first benchmark assignment is coming up pretty soon. After you watch this, please do go over the final essay prompt and the whole tab on Moodle in pretty good detail if you have not already. However, for your convenience, I will go ahead and go over it in pretty good detail right now so I can show you firsthand exactly what you need to expect. So first off, let me close up all these tabs to get them out of the way. What you're going to do, you'll see your final essay tab right here. First, you have the prompt and the rubric. As I've said in the past, the prompt contains all the information for every single assignment related to the final essay. So I'll go ahead and pull that up first for you guys. If my internet will work. Here we go. So, please do remember for your final essay that this is your prompt. You have access to it throughout the whole semester. What you're going to do is pick the 3 most significant individuals, communities, events, or things, inventions, wars, whatever it is, that we've covered in class this semester, and make an argument that, most importantly, makes a clear central claim about the history of world civilizations. As I've explained to some of you, what I mean about making a central claim is you need to pick 3 topics from our class and make an argument about how they together have made some sort of common impact upon all of world history. The way most people do that, and the way I recommend you do it, is they pick one central theme or idea that most interests them about history and pick 3 topics from that. For example, a lot of people like to focus on military history, as you might imagine, and they'll pick the 3 most important wars we talk about. That is totally acceptable. A lot of people tend to like technology when they're studying history. A lot of times people talk about the most important technological inventions or periods that we discuss. You're welcome to do that. A lot of times people like to focus on important documents or important treaties. You're welcome to do that as well. You can focus on cultural ideas like music periods even, different cultural fashion periods even that we might discuss, different laws, social movements. Really, the world is your oyster when it comes to a main theme. You just need to pick 3 topics that come from that. Please let me know if that confuses you in any way. All the thing I'll say about the 3 topics is don't pick them from the same time period. So, for example, you're my American History 2 class. Don't pick all 3 of your topics from Reconstruction. That will not get you a very good grade. I don't, of course, expect you to cover every single thing we talk about in this class, since it's only 3 topics and just 1 essay, but I do expect you to cover as much of our class as possible. So, just to make it easier, do not pick one topic or multiple topics from 1 unit. Spread it out as much as you can. Speaking of which, as I've said before to a few of you guys that I've met with, that means I do not necessarily expect you to already have a concrete idea at this point in the semester. We're very early on in the semester, obviously, so I don't expect you to necessarily know exactly what you're going to do until we get closer to the due date. To help with that, I've come up with these final essay benchmark assignments. These are the benchmark assignments you have scattered throughout the semester that are going to help me track your progress on how well you're getting ready for the final essay. Your first one, of course, is, as I said, is the final essay thesis statement. This one's coming up at the time of you probably viewing this next Friday. Now, as I put here, your thesis statement can be changed throughout the semester. All I want from this thesis statement really is for you to show me that you are already working and planning your assignment and you're coming up with ideas and hopefully at least narrowing down what your central claim or central topic is going to be. However, you are more than free to change your thesis statement. If you want to run it by me, feel free to do so, but you're not required to run your thesis statement by me until we start getting to the next benchmark assignments. You are free to change though. That's not a huge issue. Same thing with your final essay bibliography. The bibliography can change. That is totally fine. Your final essay outline is very close to the due date, so it should hopefully have a more concrete idea of what you're going to do. But even the stuff in your final essay outline can be changed before you turn it in. You basically can change your essay until the due date. That's really the only limit. So, please keep all of those details in mind. These are the major requirements. Those should be pretty straightforward. You have the whole semester to look at them. But I just want to make sure you knew where everything was in the prompt and what I expected generally. Last thing I'll mention about the final essay, if I can back this thing up. All of your assignments are turned in the final essay tab as well. Your thesis statement will go here, your bibliography will go here, your outline will go here, and the final product will go here. Do keep in mind, last thing I'll mention, it just occurred to me, your final, as you might remember, your regular writing assignments have a few days after the due date where you can still turn them in and they won't disappear from Moodle. Your final essay does not have that option, unfortunately. I believe, if I remember correctly, you have about an hour or two after the official due date to turn it in before it closes. This is due very close to when the semester ends, and my final grades have to be submitted, so I don't really have time to mess around with the due date on the final essay. So make sure you meet this due date. Okay, yeah, actually you can see here, 6 p.m. So you have an hour after the official submission time to get it turned in, or else I'm going to close it. And I will not be very flexible about changing that, unfortunately. It's not even really me being strict thing. I just don't have time to be flexible with it because I'm going to have to grade a bunch of these before grade submission time. So please do make sure you mark this due date and keep it in your mind at all times. Not all times, that's a little chaotic, that's a little extreme, but do just make sure you remember it. Any questions about that, please do let me know. Also, don't do this, by the way. It's very easy to tell people are summarizing or padding out an essay. Make sure everything you're putting in there is relevant to your argument. If you have any questions about it, please let me know as soon as you possibly can. In the meantime, let's get into what we're actually going to talk about today. If I can move my annoying face out of the way. There we go. So, to sort of give you an idea of how historians have typically used to look at the history of the American West, we're going to look at the infamous frontier thesis produced by Frederick Jackson Turner. This was from a presentation he gave at a conference in 1893 titled The Significance of the Frontier in American History. Very much simplifying it, he essentially argued that the frontier experience was the most impactful influence on the American experience and culture. So when it came to being an American and defining what an American was, the frontier experience was the most important part, according to Jackson. What he believed the frontier experience was that the line between civilization and savagery had been pushed west across the continental United States as America expanded. So as you could imagine, there would essentially be a line between civilization and savagery. America would be the civilization. The plains in the American West that was unsettled at the time would represent savagery. To him, he thought that the frontier also served as a place of escape for the American people. Essentially, once the East got too crowded and too urbanized, as we talked a little bit about the past couple of weeks, Americans would be given the option to go out to the West where they could be free and independent and really realize the American dream as far as he was concerned. Now, since obviously I can't actually talk to you face to face right now, but I do want you to think about a few things in regards to this thesis. What are some of the true things that Jackson does bring up in this thesis? Is there anything true to it? Imaginary pauses again, my favorite part of the lesson. Alright, there are arguably, according to some historians, a few true things about this frontier thesis. There obviously is some truth to the fact that some sort of line was spread out, was pushed back to the west as Americans began to settle and expand west. And as we're going to talk about in a second, it is true that many Americans viewed it this way, that they were going out and civilizing the savage West. It is also true, especially for those of you maybe who are familiar with the American colonial history and the Proclamation of 1763, many people for many years in the Americas had viewed settling out west and gaining access to all that land as some sort of escape from either British control or later American control on the East Coast. So it is true that many people did love to migrate west to try to escape city life, to a certain extent. However, I hope you can all see why this is a little bit problematic and why many historians try to argue against this guy all the time. One of my grad school classmates I had actually considers this guy his nemesis. That's how infamous he is at this point. But of course, it popularizes the idea that America expansion was a 100% good thing. I'm not going to get into the argument of whether it had good or bad qualities or both, but this would seem to suggest that it was a completely good thing. That going over into the West was bringing civilization where no civilization existed, which we can all agree, I think, is not necessarily the case. Actually, is definitely not the case. I was being too nice there. If you want to learn more about this, by the way, take American History 1 or an earlier American class at some point. But that class will go into more detail about what kind of civilizations were there. Moving on, to give a brief rundown for this class of what the Great Plains were like before America got there. The Great Plains essentially takes up the whole Midwest region, everything essentially between modern-day southern Canada and central Texas. So a big portion of the middle of the modern-day continental United States. For thousands of years, and possibly longer, but a very long time as far as archaeologists can tell, this area was populated entirely by the Plains Indians. The Plains Indians were a huge amount of tribes, but had some similar characteristics. For the most part, most of them were nomadic tribes. Nomadic obviously means that you move around from place to place, either following crops or crop seasons, or in this case, following buffalo especially. Like I said, to repeat myself a little bit, they mainly followed buffalo herds, they were expert horsemen, and they also practiced guerrilla warfare and typically had a very intense warrior culture. Are any of you out there already familiar with what guerrilla warfare is? Again, awkward pauses, my favorite part. Yeah, guerrilla warfare, for anyone who doesn't know, is of course a very informal style of warfare. It's essentially where you hunt and hide in smaller bands of troops, attack very quickly, and then run away and hide very quickly, so you don't have to fight a larger army in a long-standing battle. Plains Indians were masters of this, and is actually where American armies learned their tactics from. Now, just to keep in mind, this is something we're going to get to in a second, what effect might the end of the Civil War have on Plains Indians? Because one of the major causes of the start of the Plains Wars was actually the end or decline of the Civil War. So do keep that in mind. In the meantime, America did eventually start to take an interest. Before the 19th century, we didn't really care about the Great Plains. Why do you think we didn't care so much about the Great Plains? Well, some of you may be from the Great Plains or have lived in the Great Plains at some point. No offense to your homeland, but I think most of us can agree that compared to the rest of the country, the Great Plains appear to be very barren. As you can see here, the Great Plains are typically very wide open fields, not many useful rivers or useful resources. Remember, and this should have been covered in an American History 1 class if you took it, most early American civilization was founded upon finding resource-rich areas or cash crops. The Great Plains originally didn't have much of this. However, we did eventually start to take an interest. Anybody familiar with what caused that? Alright, one of the big ones is the gold rush. Exactly. Imaginary class that would have answered my question. So yeah, gold and the discovery of some of those resources, which we'll talk a little bit more about, is essentially what pushed this later exploration and colonization. Now, this whole idea is essentially referenced by a term you're all probably familiar with called Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny is most commonly represented in this painting right here. So, I'll give you a second to look at this painting on your own and think about what all it represents and what all it contains and what all this various symbolism means. I backed up for some reason. Hopefully you're all thinking and jotting down notes right now. That's what this is for. It's so awkward teaching people who aren't here right now. Alright, as most of you can probably figure out, this does demonstrate the idea that Western civilization is progressing to the West. This is, of course, most obviously represented by this female figure in the center of the painting. She, of course, is a pure-looking woman, clothed in all white, very obvious symbolisms of purity and enlightenment. So essentially, she's bringing purity and happiness to civilization out into the West. This is symbolized in a couple of other ways. Some of you might have noticed that the portion in the right, where civilization has reached, is bright and shiny looking. The area to the left, where civilization has not reached yet, is still dark and cloudy. So it's literally represented in a light and a dark divide. You can also see evidence of civilization following this woman as she progresses across the West. For example, those of you who are a little bit familiar with older technology might see these telegraph lines. She's holding telegraph lines in her hand as the telegraph poles are being set up as she progresses further west. So technology is being brought further west. In the background, you can see here a nice train and a more obvious train following an established railroad track that is slowly progressing as well across the West. So modern technology and modern transportation is also penetrating the West, allowing more information and more people from America to reach the unsettled West. My apologies, my cat is scratching on my door. Let me run her away real quick. Go away. Go away. No. Very sorry. That's my first awkward cat moment in one of my recorded lectures. It had to happen eventually. And of course, you can also see here the typical yeoman pioneer heading out west, bringing the American families and civilization out with them. And you can see over here the land is starting to be farmed and bringing farmers and modern farming techniques along with them as well. Even over here on the far right, you can even see very faintly a more developed American city out into the over in the top right there. Also, over to the left, there's also obvious symbols of the quote-unquote savages fleeing away from the civilization. You can see Native Americans running into the darkness away from the advancing westward expansion, as well as the buffalo herds. Keep this in mind, the buffalo herds are hugely affected by all this encroaching civilization. That's going to come up again as well. So, essentially, the whole point of this painting is to represent the idea of manifest destiny. That is divine destiny, represented by this angelic-looking being, to bring enlightenment in American civilization out into the West where the savageness is. So, that's essentially how most Americans for many years viewed this westward expansion. Miner 49er, as I mentioned, the gold rush was a big motivator for this. 1848 was when the first major gold strike occurred in California. Thousands of prospectors began to arrive in the West, especially by 1849. So for those of you who've heard the term Miner 49er, which is a great Scooby-Doo episode, or those of you who are familiar with the San Francisco 49ers in the NFL, that's where those terms came from. By 1858, the gold fever had spread. Gold had been discovered in Pikes Creek, Colorado, which led to further gold strikes in modern-day Nevada, Idaho, Montana, and both of the Dakotas. It was the Dakota Territory at the time. This also led to something called boom towns, which you can see being established right here in this picture. These were towns that were very quickly established in the West for the sole purpose of getting gold. They were typically dominated by Eastern investors. They were typically dominated by saloons as well. So for those of you who have watched any old Western, the typical depiction you're going to see is some sort of seedy boom town founded by one of these Miner 49ers. They were set up by Eastern investors who would get a return of all the gold that was discovered, and they had a seedy reputation because it was usually single, unattached men who would go in to get a quick buck from the gold. So, of course, if you're not bringing your family in with you, you might get up to more trouble. Also, these towns helped to agitate the Plains Wars by irritating the Plains Indians. They didn't like all this intruding on their land, and as you might imagine, a lot of these gold strikes were occurring in areas that were very important or sacred to various tribes of the Plains Indians. So that obviously didn't go over as well. Now, as you might guess, since these boom towns were established but very quickly in order to get gold, what do you think is going to happen when the gold is gone? Imaginary audience again. Alright, yes, as you can probably imagine, once the gold faded up, these towns dried up very quickly. So the idea of ghost towns in the American West also came from these boom towns as well. Once these towns could be set up very quickly, they were often abandoned just as quickly because all of the money was being made on the gold industry. That might remind you of something a lot of you are probably going through in your own hometowns right now, and it's something we're going to talk about further as the semester continues. But as you probably know, many Rust Belt towns have been abandoned or largely forgotten about once industry has moved overseas in America. So this is a very similar situation. When a town or even an entire city is largely set up around one single industry, if that industry goes under, the rest of the town or the city is not going to do very well. These boom towns were no exception. Some of the first conflicts were caused by a few major issues. First off, the use of reservations and a lack of agreement among native leaders. Reservations, as you probably know, were the pieces of land Native Americans would be given in return for giving up the lion's share of their land. The problem, as we're going to get into in just a second, is that many Native American leaders didn't really agree on whether they should go to these reservations or not. So many started to rebel against these reservations instead of going peacefully, which of course is understandable, and we'll go over a few examples over the next couple of days. The withdrawing of official troops for Civil War combat was also a major issue. Why would all these Civil War soldiers leaving Civil War conflict make the Plains Wars worse? Imaginary audience. Yeah, as you can probably imagine, when a lot of these troops aren't fighting the Civil War anymore, there are more troops available now to help fight against the Plains Indians. So the end of the Civil War was actually not good for many Native Americans. However, arguably the biggest cause of the Plains Wars is something called the Homestead Act, which was passed in 1862. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Homestead Act was actually a law deliberately designed to encourage westward expansion. Essentially, any person who had never taken arms against the Union, so anyone who was not a Confederate, was offered the opportunity to go out to the west and receive 160 acres of land, which of course is quite a bit of land for those of you who know anything about farming or setting up a farm. However, here's the real kicker. Not only did you get all this land, you got it for free. Crazy, right? We can't even imagine that in our modern real estate market, really. So as you can imagine, a lot of people started going out west and spreading out on Native American land since you could get all these acres for free. It's actually estimated that about 1.6 million homesteaders, as they were called, so these migrants were literally named after the Homestead Act, it was so popular. So 1.6 million of them actually went out west over the years between roughly the 1850s and the 1890s, and they settled on about 160 million acres of land. So, obviously, with all of this settling going on, 160 million acres isn't really going to leave much for Native Americans. So again, big cause of the conflict. As you can imagine, as we'll get into over the next couple of days, attacks made on civilians by both sides actually worsened the relations. Now, this can be a complex thing to deal with, because a lot of times when you hear people try to justify the Plains Wars, you'll hear them bring up violence that Native Americans committed on settlers. So how should we maybe remember and analyze this information that there were attacks made on civilians by both sides of the conflict? This is a tough one, so I'm going to let you work this out someone on your own for a second. Alright, I think maybe some of the major takeaways we can take from this is that, of course, as we'll get into, it wasn't necessarily a black and white conflict on either side, but it is important to remember this information I also put up right here. The Plains Wars were essentially caused by American expansion into Native American lands. So although there were violent attacks by both sides, and that does need to be acknowledged, it's important to remember that the cause of these wars was primarily the expansion of American power west. Native Americans weren't expanding onto American land, we were expanding onto their land. Now, does that justify every single attack that was made? That's more or less up for you to decide, but it is important to remember what actually caused this conflict. In the meantime, let's get a little bit into the Plains Wars actually in action. That was a weird way to phrase that. I sort of apologize. Some of the earlier agitators, as the government viewed them, were Red Cloud and Crazy Horse. They're credited with starting some of the major conflicts of the Plains Wars. by attacking some Captain William Fetterman in present-day Wyoming in 1866. This led to roughly 80 casualties, including Captain Fetterman himself. So obviously this led to a lot of reprisals. Initially, American troops actually had a lot of trouble confronting Native American troops. Why would that be such a problem for them? This would be a good time to check your previous notes. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Alright, yes, as you hopefully remember, one of the main characteristics of pretty much all Plains Indians was their guerrilla warfare. So the American army at this point, especially after fighting the Civil War, was still used to fighting very large-scale, pretty formal battles, for lack of a better term. That wasn't how Native Americans fought, so that was something they had to get used to. American armies actually responded with a very brutal idea called the winter campaigns. Winter campaigns are essentially where you attack tribes primarily in the winter. Why would you probably do that? Imaginary pause again. Alright, as you can imagine, it's a very typical war tactic going back many years. You attack during the winter when your enemy has less food, can move around less easily, and has all these difficulties associated with winter weather. What they would do to make it so brutal is they would go into these tribes and camps and attack people in the winter while they were sleeping, if at all possible. So it was essentially a surprise sneak attack. Winter campaigns eventually hurt Native Americans so much that most of them had no real choice but to move on to these reservations. One thing I'd also like you to think about is why these reservations are so devastating. There's a reason beyond just the loss of their land that Native Americans didn't want to go to these reservations in the first place. Just a couple of big picture ideas of why they were so rough is oftentimes they were not very well funded at all. The land they would got is obviously not the prime land available because the prime land is going to go to the new settlers. Those are just a couple of big picture reasons why these reservations had such a bad reputation. If we have time over the next few weeks, we'll spend a little bit more time talking about reservations in later years, but those are just a couple of the big picture ideas. Now, we'll go over a couple of the major battles of the Plains Wars. This is, again, I think I've said this before, why I hate survey classes. We don't really have time to cover everything I'd like to. But in the meantime, we will cover what we can. Now, you've all, I'm sure, are somewhat familiar with this battle I'm getting ready to discuss. This is the Battle of the Greasy Grass, which is also commonly known as the Battle of Little Bighorn. This is one of the most infamous battles in all of American history, actually. This occurred in June of 1876, and was a response to the sun gathering dance of Angry Indians, as they were called by the Americans. George A. Custer was the commander, as I'm sure many of you know, for the cavalry involved in the battle. He did not recognize the extent of the Sioux and Cheyenne alliance that had taken place for these sun gatherings, and led a force to move the natives back to their reservations, obviously by force. The ultimate result of this battle is that 31 natives were killed, 160 were wounded. The 7th Cavalry, 268 of them were killed, 55 of them were wounded, obviously including George A. Custer himself. Now, I won't spend a ton of time going into the details of the battle because we don't really have time, unfortunately. But one thing I want to do is talk a little bit about the impact and how we've remembered Little Bighorn. Now, does anyone actually know why I called the battle of the Greasy Grass? Why does it, well, let's start there. I'm moving ahead of myself. Alright, for those of you who aren't aware, the Battle of the Greasy Grass is actually what the Cheyenne and the Sioux Native Americans have called the Battle of Little Bighorn. So one thing historians have typically done at this point is try to remember these battles by their Native American names instead of remembering them how the Americans labeled them. Why is that maybe such an important thing to remember? Well, to answer that, think about what we also typically call the Battle of Little Bighorn. We typically call it, as you can see over here on the left, Custer's Last Stand. Now, what does Custer's Last Stand imply about this battle? Give you a second to think about that again. I'm getting tired of these awkward pauses, but COVID, what are you going to do? Alright, again, as you might have guessed, this whole Little Bighorn idea, especially the Custer's Last Stand idea, is essentially just a continuation of or one of the inspirations really for Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis. It paints the idea of a noble last stand of American heroes against savage Native Americans. However, as I mentioned, well, again, I'm not going to really get into the moral conundrums of what justifies what and how much of everything was justified. It is important to remember, like I said, that these conflicts were initially started by Americans taking away Native American land and forcing them on these reservations against their will. So many historians today argue that it's important to remember these battles by their Native American names to represent a more accurate idea of why the Plains Wars were fought and who the agitators arguably were. Now again, does that mean that everyone in Custer's 7th Cavalry deserved to die? I'm not going to get into that, of course. That's something you can all decide on your own as well. But it is important to remember to try to have a more accurate and historically relevant representation of historical events. I said that maybe more complicated than I need to, but hopefully you get the idea. So, a couple of things I wanted to mention about how the battle has been remembered throughout history. One of the biggest inspirations for popular depictions of the battle was actually Elizabeth Bacon Custer, George Custer's wife. She actually wrote 3 books about her husband, which all, of course, praise his bravery and tactical genius, which informed many of the depictions of the battle since. In 1879, the area was declared a national cemetery to protect 7th Cavalry graves. This is, of course, probably a very relevant issue I think we can all understand because of the issue of how to deal with Confederate national cemeteries to this day. This is obviously a very controversial issue. So again, it raises the question: is it is it appropriate to protect the graves of these American veterans, or is it honoring heroes who don't deserve it? Again, very important question that we all have to wrestle with, especially given our current political climate. In 1946, the area was actually declared to be the Custer Battlefield National Monument. So again, memorializing this idea of a brave last stand against savage Native Americans. So again, whatever your opinions on this battle, I think we can all agree that especially this last one is quite problematic. So again, I won't go into much more detail about this, but just do remember, it is important to think about how we respond to these legacies of the battle, and sort of in a similar way to what we talked about with the Lost Cause last week. It's very important to remember how historical events are remembered and how they're analyzed. Now, after this battle, this mostly led to essentially the beginning of the end of the Plains Indians' way of life. Greasy Grass is considered by most historians to be the last major last stand of the Plains Indians. There was no real significant alliance or significant battle after that. There are a couple of major reasons for this beyond the defeats. First, and arguably most importantly, is the impact on local wildlife. Remember, as I said earlier, if I can get to the right place, the entire culture of Plains Indians was centered around following buffalo herds. Almost all of their tools and all of their homes were made out of some part of the buffalo. And of course, they needed the food, so pretty much every aspect of their life depended upon buffalo herds. By 1893, the buffalo population had gone from 60 to 100 million all the way down to 400. So again, as I said, every aspect of their life depended upon these buffaloes. Without them, they really have no way to sustain their lifestyle. This infamous picture you might have all seen depicts a huge pile of buffalo skulls being posed with Americans posing around the skull pile. Now, what does that suggest about all of these buffalo skulls, the way this picture is set up? Again, imaginary picture, or imaginary pause. I'm losing my mind a little bit. I think we're all affected by quarantine at this point. Now again, as you might imagine, this wasn't a coincidental thing. It was actually a policy of the American Army, when possible, to exterminate buffalo herds because they knew without the buffalo, the Plains Indians would not be able to sustain their lifestyle. So this was not an accidental thing and just accidental overhunting. For many people, it was a deliberate policy. And as I mentioned earlier with the Homestead Act, the amount of settlers was a huge issue. With all the settlers pouring in, as Native Americans suffered more defeats, they just didn't have enough people to fight all the new settlers that were coming in. What is considered to be the end of the Plains Wars is something you may have heard of from the reading, hopefully. The 1890 Wounded Knee, quote-unquote, conflict. This was a response to the Ghost Dance, which was being conducted by the Lakota throughout the 1890 period. Now, you have a reading on this assigned for this week. If you haven't already done so, please make sure you check over this. What exactly was the ghost dance, and why was it such a huge issue for the American Army and for American politicians? Make sure you keep that in mind as we go forward. Also, there were specific protests going on. Make sure you check the reading and the military report as well. What were some of the things the Native Americans were protesting? Pay particular attention to this, because this will actually give you some more specific idea of what some of the Native Americans on reservations were protesting. This will, of course, give you a better idea of why reservations were such a problem for Native Americans. By the time this quote-unquote conflict was over, 200 men and women and children were killed, all among the Lakota, of course. The reason I have this in quotes is that none of the Lakota, most if not all of the Lakota, were unarmed, and they were fired on first by the American Army. So it has been controversial for this to be called a conflict for many years. Speaking of which, throughout history, Wounded Knee has sort of alternated between being remembered as a battle or a massacre. Actually, 20 soldiers who were present at the conflict were actually awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. For those of you who don't know, the Congressional Medal of Honor is the highest military award any American serviceman can receive. So, this is again another important distinction. Why does it matter whether we remember Wounded Knee as a battle or as a massacre? Alright, as I think you can probably guess as well, this goes back, as pretty much everything has so far, to Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis. If you remember it as a battle, it's just another part of our frontier experience. We're expanding out into the West, and we're subduing savage, evil people. If we remember it as a massacre, that's a bit more of a difficult memory for us, but it forces us to recognize the impact of American expansion upon Native American communities. So again, that's why I keep bringing up historical memory. Historical memory and how we remember these types of events matters. So, make sure you keep that in mind, especially by the time we get to the next topic. Now, in the meantime, we'll go ahead and wrap things up for this topic with our final reminders. I apologize if this one took so long, but I wanted to make sure I went through the final essay details. Now, just remember, your first content quiz is coming up on September 11th at 5 p.m. By the time you view this, it should already be posted to Moodle. Your final essay thesis statements are, of course, due on September the 18th. As I said earlier, all the information for that assignment and the submission area is already on Moodle. Your second writing assignment is due September the 25th. The prompt and the rubric are already on Moodle, so you can look at that whenever you would like. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all at some point this week for Topic 2. Thank you.